Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session. I think it'll be a very interesting session. The title is ROK, China and Japan as Responsible Nuclear Suppliers. Of course, there are a lot of issues that this panel will consider, and especially new considerations and challenges in nuclear power, some of them related to confidence in the safety of nuclear power plants, especially in light of the Fukushima accident, major changes in the landscape as far as technological owners for nuclear energy technology, new countries such as Korea becoming major suppliers of nuclear power plants, as well as new client user nations embarking on the use of nuclear technology. And of course, the situation also changing in the very established parts of the world that in terms of nuclear power use, for example, in the United States, where nuclear power is sort of level in terms of its use, and projections for its growth being modest at best, at least in the short to medium time frame. So a number of new issues and challenges related to nuclear supply and safe and secure use of nuclear power technologies. So that's the basic subject of the panel, and we have with us three speakers who prepared some talking points related to this subject, and it's my pleasure to introduce them to you, beginning first with Mr. Lee Hee-yong, who's the Senior Vice President for Overseas Nuclear Project Development at KEPCO. Previously, he was Project Director for the UAE project. He's worked at KEPCO for more than 30 years in construction management, quality assurance, long-term power planning, training, and nuclear plant commissioning and operations, and he's worked internationally in New York and Paris as part of KEPCO's organization, specializing in quality surveillance and contract management. Mr. Lee, would you please give us your talking points?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me to have this opportunity to speak with you at such an important meeting. My name is Hee-yong Lee, Senior Vice President of KEPCO's Overseas Nuclear Project Department. And I'd like to, first of all, to provide you with a brief introduction of my company, KEPCO. As a government-owned company, KEPCO is responsible for generating, transmitting, and distributing Korea's electricity. We operate 23 nuclear power plants, which supply a total of 20 gigawatts domestically. At present, an additional 5 units, 6.6 gigawatts of nuclear power plants are under construction domestically, while we are constructing 4 units of APR 1400 in the United Arab Emirates. Through this opportunity, KEPCO is actively striving to promote our participation in more overseas nuclear plant projects. Nuclear power plays an important role within Korea, China, and Japan in terms of ensuring energy security and preserving the environment. Through these three countries are independent nations, we are all faced with common threats and risks. Above all, the Fukushima accident not only had a significant impact on the global nuclear industry, but also these three countries. For example, the accident aggravated concerns that nuclear energy was no longer safe, while the negative sentiment has influenced the potential for more nuclear power plant projects. In this light, the recent nuclear test conducted by North Korea has further increased international anxieties. So collectively, these issues have had an unfavorable impact on the renewal of the 1-3 agreement between Korea and the States. As we are all aware, the earthquake and subsequent tsunami that hit the east coast of Japan led to the Fukushima accident. Although Korea does not rely on an active fault line, concerns that an earthquake or tsunami with similar destructiveness will hit the eastern part of Korea, posing a threat to the safety of this country's nuclear power plants. Crossing the Yellow Sea, as most of the nuclear power plants under construction in China are located mainly in the eastern coast. In the event of radiation leak, the impact on both Korea and Japan would most likely be severe. That said, however, the three nations are the most active in pushing forward with nuclear power plant projects compared to other countries around the world. Korea and Japan are constructing the third generation nuclear power plants with their own technology, while China is adopting nuclear technologies from France and the United States. China is growing as one of the largest global nuclear markets and is currently seeking to make inroads into overseas nuclear power plant projects. Although Japan is also facing difficulties getting the public support, the country is striving to take part in new nuclear construction project in several countries. Japan has also recently started a new nuclear project in the United Kingdom. Amid these circumstances, the three nations must exert their collective efforts in reinforcing the safety of the respective nuclear power plants in operation. Only by doing so will they be able to eradicate the anxiety the general public has toward nuclear power plants. These efforts should include cooperation with international nuclear organizations like WANO or IAEA, with the aim to operate the nuclear power plants in a completely transparent manner. Furthermore, it is necessary for the three countries to adopt and abide by robust quality requirements and licensing requirements in constructing Gen 3 nuclear power plants. Since all these possess a strong supply chain for the construction and operation of nuclear power plants, they are also obliged to adopt more strict quality requirements. Nuclear power regulators have to cooperate among themselves and equip themselves with systems that allow the sharing of radioactivity-related information. The biggest risk related to nuclear projects is delays in construction, along with subsequent increase in project cost. To prevent this, the successful construction of nuclear power plants by the three nations as an exemplary case could contribute significantly to reducing financial risks within the international financial market. In this regard, the three nations must share their best practice. China, Japan, and Korea have similar, but at the same time, their very own unique culture. However, the safety culture of a nuclear power plant must be implemented strictly and in accordance with international regulations. These regulations must be put into practice transparently, not on a respective basis by individual nation, but globally. Negligence by one nation can have a broader impact beyond its borders. More than anything, we have to distinguish nuclear power plants from nuclear weapons in terms of nuclear non-proliferation and also gain public trust by constructing and operating nuclear power plants under a safety policy of energy security and environment protection. The nuclear industry faces a difficult situation politically, which comes along with leadership changes within the three nations. The only solution to this is for those in the nuclear industry to regain public trust by addressing natural calamities and by adopting rigorous operational management. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. And let me mention the format for this will be that we'll have each of the speakers give their comments, their talking points in turn. Hold your questions. We'll have an opportunity later to ask questions after the discussion portion of the panel. Our next panelist is Ms. Jane Nakano. She's fellow for the Energy and National Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in the United States. Previous positions she's held were as lead staff for the U.S. Department of Energy on U.S. energy engagements with China, Japan, Indonesia, North Korea, and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. She's the author of Next Steps for U.S. Liquid Natural Gas Exports, Prospects for Shale Gas Development in Asia, and Civil Nuclear Energy Cooperation between the United States and Japan. Ms. Nakano?
Thank you so much. First off, I'd like to thank Asan for having me here, and it's been fantastic to see lots of distinguished sort of speakers this morning illustrate a lot of challenges. But here, I guess my task, I think I'm going to focus a little more on what may be happening in Japan a little bit, and what sort of challenges they might have in this new environment post-Fukushima. But then I guess I'll end by sharing sort of my thoughts or sort of questions for all three countries, Korea, China, and Japan, as what it may mean to be responsible exporters. I mean, of three countries, Japan has the most sort of established and longest history as supplier of nuclear power plants. Also, Japan is quite unique in that it is a nuclear weapon state that is party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but then also with major fuel cycle facilities. But Fukushima, I mean, happened about a year and, well, 2 years, basically 2 years ago, and the situation for nuclear has changed dramatically. Not to mention that today there are only 2 commercial nuclear power reactors that are in operation. That's a result of, broadly speaking, the public anxiety over the capability of the government, perhaps industry, and also regulators in being able to present case, or being able to manage the type of accidents that happened in Fukushima. But then also going forward, the Japanese government has been going through in efforts to establish the independence of its regulatory body, but I think the public, I'm not sure if they're quite convinced. I mean, I think there's, of course, these things do not happen overnight. Even in the U.S., the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, it took them at least a decade after 3 Mile Island to become its own force in assuring the public that it is having sound regulatory function in the framework. But so going back to today's situation in Japan, so 2 reactors are operating, and it's still unclear exactly how quickly sort of the scope and pace of remainder of the reactors coming back online. And it is quite unlikely for Japan to pursue very proactive, aggressive nuclear expansion plan it had prior to Fukushima. The idea prior to Fukushima was to have nuclear being one of the focus of their efforts to have less dependency on imported energy. The specific targets was to increase the share of nuclear in its power generation from about 30% in 2008 to about 50% in 2030. And this sort of a goal called for 9 new reactors to be built by 2020, an additional 5 to be built by 2030. So, but that was basically became politically unsustainable after Fukushima. Having said that, though, but Japan has been demonstrating its strong commitment as responsible supplier. In terms of technology, they do have advanced reactor technologies. Going forward, if you will, sort of making sort of lemonade out of lemon, I mean, they will have quite a bit of decontamination and decommissioning expertise and experiences to share with the world. And that will be relevant whether there's another, accident or not. I mean, for example, Germany will be decommissioning many. I mean, there are a lot. I mean, these activities are always there, but there will be lessons that they can share with the rest of the world in terms of sort of post-accident reactor conditions and how that may affect decommissioning activities and such. Also, in terms of legal and regulatory framework, Japan has decided to take its regulatory body out of a ministry that had been promoting nuclear energy. And from what I understand, Korea has also been exploring that option. The Nuclear Security and Safety Committee or Commission is a sort of initiative, and I think the regulatory and legal frameworks are very essential for a country to be to claim itself as a responsible supplier. And also, Japan has been making a strong commitment to safety and security norms. Japan was among first to ratify the additional protocol. And also, like the United States, Japan has the adoption of AP, additional protocol, as a condition of supply, which I hope will be replicated or adopted by many other countries as well. But there are challenges, and before I go into sort of challenges that may be common for all the emerging suppliers or the suppliers, exporters in general, Japanese industry landscape is quite crowded with 3 strong vendors with history of providing reactor technologies, and also in the after of Fukushima, sort of the utilities are still trying to seek the clarity they need in determining to what extent they be part of some of the potential export deals, if you will. And it's very interesting that these things are pretty much sort of against some of the emerging trends that I've come to notice in the world. I mean, it looks, especially given the Korea's success in UAE deal, it looks to me that there are growing interest among potential new entrants for supplier to come in and then and have the operation being part of the package, at least for the short term. And also the crowded domestic market model is also a little counter, although the U.S. has a similar situation. But if you look at very successful, other competitive supplier countries, France, Germany, and Russia, and of course until recently Germany, they do have limited number of utilities and vendors that could perhaps more effectively work with their government in selling their products. Then common challenges, sort of food for thought for all of us here, is given growing interest in nuclear energy by countries that have not previously had commercial operation, any country that will be going into these markets will also have to take the safety culture notion, as my colleague just mentioned. That is essential. I mean, technology, legal framework, human resources, and international commitments, they're necessary but not sufficient. I think the ability to enforce regulations is fundamental. I mean, you can frame it, you can laminate, beautifully drafted, documents, but you have to be able to enforce it domestically. But then that would, I think, translate into their sort of approach to overseas expansion as well. But of course, they're concerned. I mean, it is sort of concern. I mean, I think Fukushima has intensified a fierce competition among suppliers. There are many reasons, but I think one of them is that among the mature economies, where the population growth is not as strong as in, say, some of the emerging economies, the nuclear, there's lessened degree of interest in nuclear. Of course, Germany and Switzerland come to mind as the ones that made a decision to phase out. But there are other countries that are looking to reduce its dependence. And given the even ever sort of fierce competitive supplier scene, there's always pressure to perhaps cut the corners, and that that would be unfortunate. But again, going back to sort of the what's necessary and sufficient are two separate things. And I hope that all three suppliers in East Asia would be sort of good rivals in ever pushing the bar high, and for for the region's stability and for the world's stability. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Nakano. Okay, our third panelist is Mr. Jasper Panza, who's a PhD candidate at the Center for Science and Security Studies at the King's College London. Previously, he was a research analyst at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He joined that institute under the Stanton Nuclear Security Fellowship Program, and he has a Bachelor of Science degree and an MA degree as well from the King's College London. Jasper?
Thank you, Dr. Khalil. I'd also like to thank very much the Asan Institute for inviting me to this excellent conference. I should add to my bio that I'm not working at IISS anymore. I think it's a slightly outdated bio that you have got, unfortunately. But I left in November. But I should acknowledge IISS here in this presentation because this presentation is based on the work that I conducted at the Institute. So I'd like to focus on China. And like other countries in East Asia, China plans to add reprocessing to its nuclear fuel cycle. And China also has the goal to introduce fast breeder reactors. So I will look at the status of China's nuclear energy program and at the technical safety and security implications China will have to overcome when it moves to a closed nuclear fuel cycle. And then towards the end, I will look at the consequences this may have on China being a responsible supplier for nuclear technologies in the future. So let's start with an overview of China's nuclear power program. China's got a very ambitious nuclear power program. There are 16 operating reactors, around 26 are under construction at the moment. There's a generating capacity of around 60 gigawatts, which is expected to be reached by 2020. However, like in other countries, the Fukushima accident has had a big impact, and China had to take rigorous measures to respond. For example, construction was halted for a long time. The approval process for nuclear projects was put on hold, and it's only now starting to gain pace. And crucially, only Generation 3 designs are to be approved in China from now on, which I think is a very big hurdle for new nuclear projects. And I think it seems clear to China's leadership that that an accident in China would have serious consequences to China's entire nuclear program. So what Fukushima has not changed in China is China's long-standing commitment to close the nuclear fuel cycle. Since the 1980s, China's official plan was to extract uranium and plutonium from spent fuel from light water reactors and to use that extracted fissile material for fast breeder reactors that China hopes to commercialize by 2035. Energy security is the main argument brought forward by proponents of closing the nuclear fuel cycle in China. So even though this long-term goal has been clearly defined, at the moment there's no comprehensive or specific roadmap as to how China would like to achieve these goals. Nevertheless, China has already taken some important steps into that direction. For example, with regards to reprocessing, in 2010, China commissioned a pilot reprocessing plant with a capacity of 50 tons per year. There were also plans for an 80 tons per year commercial reprocessing plant, which was meant to be ready by 2020, but this goal now appears very unlikely to be met. With regards to fast reactors, in 2011, the China experimental fast reactor was connected to the grid. This is an experimental sodium-cooled reactor. It's currently fueled with highly enriched uranium, but it's soon to be fueled with MOX fuel. And also, there's a MOX fuel fabrication plant under construction. So many important steps have already been taken towards a closed nuclear fuel cycle. However, there are some technical challenges that China needs to overcome if it wishes to introduce fast breeder reactors. Many countries have tried to introduce their technology, but so far with very little success. Pilot fast reactors built to date have proven to be unreliable and unsafe, and also very expensive. And mostly that's because of the liquid sodium cooling system, which is very difficult to handle. And a small accident or a small inconsistency can cause very substantial damage and high costs. However, despite these technical challenges, China has got some unique characteristics that may help to overcome these technical barriers. Outside China, high capital costs of new facilities have deterred investors and operators. Within China, however, research and development is directed as well as funded by central government. Similarly, a state-controlled nuclear regulator may undermine nuclear safety, as it may be the case in China, but this may also help accelerate the approval process for new nuclear technologies. So let's take a look at the safety and security implications of a closed nuclear fuel cycle. And I think it goes without saying that the challenge of operating a nuclear fuel cycle safely and securely increases with the complexity of the fuel cycle. This is, for example, because additional facilities and longer transport routes need to be protected and kept safe, protected from nuclear sabotage attacks, terrorist sabotage attacks, for example. To date, China has not had a serious nuclear safety accident, but there's always room for improvement. And I think this is an important point to remember when considering how China's future fuel cycle may look like, and also China's upcoming role as a major nuclear supplier. Two of the key issues are that one is that there's been a chronic shortage of experienced and qualified safety staff in China. And secondly, China does not have a fully independent and sufficiently authoritative regulator, as I mentioned earlier. So, but apart from these safety and security concerns, the real challenge with the closed nuclear fuel cycle is, of course, to prevent proliferation in the future. A commercial scale reprocessing capability provides, of course, a theoretical ability to produce weapons, to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons at a faster rate. And also, fast reactors either run on MOX fuel or plutonium metal fuel. And so their use significantly increases the accessibility of nuclear weapons usable materials. So for these reasons, outside China, there's been a concern that commercial reprocessing facilities may potentially support China's strategic nuclear weapons program. China is currently estimated to hold around 1.8 tons of military plutonium, but the production of that has stopped in the 1990s. And of course, unfortunately, it cannot be ruled out that in the future, China may choose to increase that stockpile of plutonium. And a factor worth mentioning here is that China is the only P5 country that has not officially declared a moratorium and ending fissile material production for military purposes. These concerns seem to be responsible for the failure of moving forward with the 800 ton per year reprocessing plant that I mentioned earlier. In 2010, an agreement with Areva was signed for the plant, but I am told that France insisted on technical and political assurances that the plutonium extracted could not be used for nuclear weapons, and France objected that the plant would be built close to the site where in the past China has produced fissile nuclear materials, military fissile materials. And for that reason, the Areva plant did not, seems that the Areva plant didn't work out. So what does that mean for China's future role as a responsible nuclear supplier? It is of course important that all suppliers of nuclear and dual-use technologies act responsibly by prioritizing non-proliferation norms over commercial and strategic interests. Unfortunately, China does not have an entirely clean track record in that regard. For example, China exported dual-use items in the 1990s, including to Pakistan. China's track record improved substantially when China joined the Nuclear Suppliers Group in 2004. But an unfortunate exception remains, and that's the transfer of 2 reactors to Pakistan, the Chashma 3 and 4 reactors, which are now being built at the moment. This is a problematic deal because it undermines the NSG's requirements for recipient countries to have concluded a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA. So if China obtains commercial scale reprocessing and becomes the first country to demonstrate that fast breeder reactors can be safe, reliable and commercially viable, China may of course be interested to export these technologies to countries that equally seek a high degree of energy security. China may also in the future offer advanced fuel cycle services, such as reprocessing in other countries' spent fuel and sending back MOX fuel. But many of course would argue that the world needs fewer facilities that produce and operate with weapons-usable fissile materials. And so the export of reprocessing and fast reactor technologies from China would go contrary to global non-proliferation goals. I admit this is a very hypothetical and long-term issue, but there's no guarantee that in 20 years' time proliferation norms will be consistently put over commercial and strategic interests. There's also no such thing as export safeguards that would prevent the transfer of sensitive reprocessing technologies to non-nuclear weapon states that cite their NPT Article 4 rights. But I believe this potential problem provides a strong argument to work towards slowing the spread of reprocessing and fast reactor technologies sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much. Although it's not maybe central to the topic here, I wanted to maybe give a bit more balanced view of the record of the fast reactors that have been operated worldwide. I think you characterized them as unsafe and pretty much a failure. I think the situation is one of a mixed record. A number of these fast neutron facilities have been built and operated in several countries around the world, mainly for demonstration of technology and for just getting some testing and experimental capabilities. And the record has been mixed. There have been a number of these reactors that had problems, but a number of others have been very successfully and safely operated. For example, the BN 600 reactor in Russia has been operated for many years with over 70% capacity factor. The experimental breeder reactor in the U.S. operated for many years successfully. So it is a little bit more nuanced situation. It is true that that technology has never been successfully commercialized, and that remains a goal for countries pursuing that technology. Anyway, so relative to the topic of the panel, I'm just wondering if we could be a little more systematic in actually defining what it means to be a responsible nuclear supplier. What are the dimensions of that? I think all of you have touched on it to varying degrees, but I'm especially interested in what needs to be in place in the user countries, new user countries, and what are the responsibilities of a supplier relative to making sure that these countries are prepared to deal with the safety, security, environmental issues of nuclear power. Let me just throw that out to the panel, and if anyone would like to take a shot at it.
I think literally the operator shall be responsible all the operation and maintenance, including the accident and incident, all kinds of things. But for the for the countries which are willing to introduce the nuclear power plant at the first time, I think they have to prepare the concrete nuclear industry infrastructure in terms of manpower development and nuclear regulation and legislation and independent nuclear regulatory body and nuclear law and the international convention. So without those kind of infrastructure, when we penetrate into these countries, I think it will. We can have some I think some mistake or misunderstanding, and so I think the nations which are planning the introduction of nuclear power plant shall have plenty time to prepare in advance the introduction of nuclear power plants. I think that is very essential.
Yeah, it's clear that the user countries have a lot of responsibility to prepare the way to use nuclear technology. Can we use the UAE case as an example?
Yes.
And maybe you could touch on what is their state of readiness and how is it evolving?
As I understand, the United Arab Emirates has prepared the prerequisite conditions to introduce the nuclear power plant in advance. They made a roadmap for nuclear power plant with the consultation of international society, including the United States, and they invited many different consultants from all over the world. So they prepared the transparent roadmap for nuclear power, and also they had a membership in the International Nuclear Society. So that's the key point before starting the bidding process. And during the bidding process also, they hired the international consultation company to get the advice and to get the transparent evaluation. So after that, we are constructing a nuclear power plant in collaboration with UAE, but everyone is watching on the progress and how we are doing there. Mm-hmm. So everything shall be very, very transparent, but the only concern is that the nuclear legislation and regulation has been now in preparation. So there will be some risks to be mismatched between the contract and the new regulation. That's our big concern.
Thank you. I'm wondering, do you have any follow-up
Sure.
comments?
I actually think that what Korea did in UAE case to have this independent oversight commission is a very good model, and it really is good for obviously for UAE to be able to convince the world, but also for the supplier side to really show the commitment. But then, as you know. It's the matter with transparency and public confidence. Those are really key things. And just to quickly add, I mean, the human resources is a really key component. And of course, you know, the utilities can provide training to the operators, but then also there also has to be sort of regulatory engagement to really help them train inspectors as well. I mean, these things go hand in hand. But so just my sort of 2 fingers.
And that capability is developing, as you can tell, as far as you can tell, in the UAE, the ability to regulate and the ability to have an indigenous oversight for their reactors.
My understanding is that there are engagements going on with active participations from the Korean side, but I don't know the whole details about the sort of UAE side, how quickly they're digesting and then but that's probably
Right.
The big concern in UAE is the mix in terms of human power, in terms of specialists, and everything is mixed. So they have to create one direction, but I don't know how long it will take. But anyway, they need a lot of efforts to combine all the key concerns and to produce the one direction and one kind of norm.
And I wonder if we could touch on the issues related to the spent fuel also. I mean, it was, of course, mentioned in the talking points and concerns about closing the fuel cycle through recycling and reprocessing and recycling. But there are also issues related to very long-term storage of spent nuclear fuel because the self-protection decays away after some decades, and so you do have an accumulating inventory of plutonium in the spent fuel. So what is emerging as far as international capabilities to deal with accumulating spent fuel in new user countries, and in terms of responsibilities of suppliers to ensure the safe long-term management of that fuel. Mr. Panza, would you like
Sure.
to?
I think this also goes back to your original question: what are the requirements? What are the requirements for user countries or countries that accept nuclear technologies from suppliers? I think one, apart from the obvious answers like safeguards and so on and safety, I think it would be helpful if user countries would have a spent fuel management policy right from the beginning when they accept nuclear technologies from supplier countries. There should be at least a plan, because, or maybe there should be a take-back agreement of the spent fuel back to supplier countries. You mentioned that there may be a problem if they have geological repositories of spent fuel, and like having a plutonium mine where over 100 years most of the radioactivity of the spent fuel decays, and over 1,000 years, well, a lot of it will be gone. This is a problem, but the alternative, or one of the alternatives, like reprocessing it, is probably a worse alternative, because it may be better to have at least proliferation protection for 100 years, but if you reprocess, then you have all the plutonium and the above ground, which is much more accessible. So yeah, there's no easy solution, but at least I should be thinking about a solution right from the beginning.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
So let me cause a problem here and mix it up a little. Mr. Lee, when you're talking about actions for a responsible supplier, you focused on safety, but there was no talk about the responsibility of the supplier rather than the supplyee in terms of non-proliferation. Our Japanese colleague said there's intense competition. That competition presumably will increase as China slowly enters the export market. Japan has a limited brand name, I think it's safe to say right now. South Korea has had a lot of ROK processing, and it seems to have signed a different sort of agreement with the UAE than the United States did with respect to the fuel cycle. I mean, it seems to me, looking at the non-proliferation person, this is a recipe for countries to compete, and when they can't compete on price, compete on transfer of technology. Why am I wrong?
Technically, I think the responsibility of nuclear technology provider is to strictly apply the code and standard for manufacturing and design of nuclear power plant. That's the first step. And commercially, we have to make the strong commitments of construction on time, within budget. If we fail, it will raise a lot of money, extra money, so we will we will face in a financial crisis. So technically, commercially, we have such kind of responsibility, and those responsibilities are written in the contract. So the supplier meet the contract first, and also the supplier meet all the requirements given by the country's nuclear regulatory body. They ask a lot of things, even beyond the contract. So we have to resolve such kind of high level of expectation in terms of safety and regulation and etc. If not, I think the project will be in fail. So, and every country wants the technology transfer. Why? I think one of the main reasons to introduce the nuclear power plant is to boost up the industry and infrastructure by adopting the nuclear technology. So they want to build up, for example, the UAE would like to introduce the Korean model of nuclear industry within the very short period. So they have to bring all our best practice in every area. But the technology, nuclear technology transfer is a little bit different from the local contents boost up and booming the related industry. I think we have to think about also the proliferation of such critical technology. So we apply the nuclear export law given by the U.S. NRC and U.S. DOE. So we strictly apply those kind of things, whether it is good or not in terms of such kind of export control system.
I don't feel very satisfied by that answer. No, I don't want to carry on a dialogue here. I mean, maybe the other panelists would as well.
I wonder if you could just elaborate on what aspects of the export control regime trouble you, and you know, where are the areas of concern, and what might supplier companies, commercial organizations, but then maybe also the countries themselves.
Sure.
What responsibilities do they bear?
Well, I think, you know, I mean, a lot of it comes back to the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and there are people in this room who know this stuff better than I do, but it seems to me as we go forward, the central thesis here was if countries continue to make ad hoc decisions about their transfer of sensitive technologies, and we have the example of China making transfers that were outside of those established rules, and if there's intense economic competition where there are some companies are going to die and where countries have a inherent interest, in particular, either reprocessing or enrichment technologies, want there be an incentive in order to win contracts when countries want those to compromise on that. And in some ways, the UAE agreement appears, and I'm not an expert on it, that the U.S. was able to get a commitment from the UAE for no interest in enrichment and then got a different sort of agreement with Korea. So I'm just, it's not today. It's about, as our colleague from Britain says, 20 years from now, when it's not just the current suppliers who are beating their heads in together, it's China too. I'm just wondering about the natural drift of things. I'm not making any accusations.
Any further comments?
Just to quickly comment, to the extent that I was, sort of kind of busier nodding my head in agreement. What the U.S. negotiated with the UAE, I see, the difference in terms, having a potentially longer effect, complication. Other than that, I'm not sure exactly what would be on the menu of policy options or some sort of architectures that a government should start looking at this point. But that's also part of sort of everyone's sort of supplier side efforts to increase transparency. And you did raise a good point. Good question.
Yes. Yeah, please. Oh.
Thank you, Sharon. Sharon Squassoni from CSIS. So I'll give it a go. Let's define responsible nuclear supply. Post-Fukushima, people's expectations are raised far beyond what the actual regime does, right? They think the IAEA, as Jane said the other day, there should be a SWAT team that goes in and helps out when there's an accident. Nuclear security, they should be, I think the average citizen would be shocked if they knew just how voluntary the system is. And so, but there are different layers here. And I think at the level of, I don't know what you want to call it, primary major vendor supplier, you do have these nuclear cooperation agreements. And vendors will always say, well, yes, we comply with the regulations. So why do we have some proliferation problems? Well, because you go down the supply chain, and often in the dual-use area, you find things. But even at the vendor level, you find some issues. Iran got some interesting technology from major nuclear suppliers, as well as AQ-Con. It's not just an illegal problem, an illegal network problem. And I think what Jasper pointed out is that we folks who are positive about nuclear energy, nobody ever wants to really talk about the issue with fast reactors, which is that you need reprocessing. And then you wander into a plutonium economy. And what's happened over the last 20 years is we haven't gotten to the commercialization of fast reactors, so there's all this buildup of plutonium with not many places to go. And in Japan, it's acute now. So I don't think it's the responsibility of the industry to look at that. That's a government issue. And if you move down, if the advanced nuclear suppliers move down that path of fast reactors, it's all Gen 4, right? And what we're going to hear is that Gen 4 is better than Gen 3, right? It's more safe. It's everything wonderful. We're going to burn transuranics and life will be under the rainbow. But there are still going to be, as long as the regime itself does not restrict enrichment or reprocessing, which are two sensitive technologies that you can use to make fissile material for weapons or reactor fuel, we're going to have to do something else. And when I say the regime, I say right now we're talking about the NPT. The Nuclear Suppliers Group does contain voluntary restrictions. But as we've seen over the past few years, the NSG is fraying at the edges. And in part, it's the fault of America, as well as some other suppliers. So sorry, I didn't mean to go off on that tangent. Responsible nuclear supply, can we go a little bit beyond? So we can't get agreement in the nuclear suppliers group on the additional protocol as a condition of supply. So can we, as individual countries, do that? Japan does it, the US does it. Korea, I think, has been asking for that. Nobody wants to agree in the nuclear suppliers group, but you could do it among suppliers. But that presupposes that you have to want to do this, right? Because the competition has intensified. I think Jane is absolutely right. After Fukushima, there aren't so many contracts out there. And where they're going to be are going to be in countries that have a few problems. And so I think when we talk about responsible nuclear supply, we might want to go beyond a little bit where the regime is asking for us to go. Industry has clear incentives, reputational and other things, market share, all of that, to kind of look inside yourself and come up with some creative ideas. Government needs to be a whole lot more creative. And I'll stop there, but maybe you have some reactions to what I said.
Just one clarification. Are your concerns related primarily to fast reactors and recycling associated to fast reactors, or also just more broadly with the light water reactor technology or ones through types of fuel cycles?
My main concerns are enrichment and reprocessing technology. And so to the extent that fast reactors funnel into that.
Yeah.
A perfect example is laser enrichment.
Right.
How well are we doing?
Right.
On exports? And when you look at those CO2 lasers that might be used for, the Silex process, how well could a country do if they go right in under the level that it's controlled at?
Right, right. So yeah, and maybe I could just quickly comment. I mean, you've rightly identified the parts of the fuel cycle that are the most sensitive and about which you have to exercise the greatest care, enrichment and reprocessing. You're right, reprocessing is an integral part of a fast reactor fuel cycle. At least conventionally, there is the possibility that new types of fast reactors could be operated in a so-called breed and burn mode. It requires going to much, much higher burn-ups and material damage levels than what we've been able to sustain with current technologies. But you're right, reprocessing is intimately related to fast reactors with technologies that we know about or have proven. But I don't believe it's the intent to make those as widely used. They would need to be deployed in situations that are appropriate and appropriately safeguarded. And I believe that's the conventional view of them, as far as I know. Yes.
I guess earlier, Jasper mentioned, it's very important to, for the supplier side to communicate with new potential entrants about the importance of having sort of a total picture or having the preparedness. And a little bit related to Sharon's comment as well is, I think it's, for example, it would be very useful for countries, my country, the United States, to have successful, repository. So I think, so it's not so much for the world to sort of single out, say, Korea, Japan, and China, or, and also, potential newcomers, but it's even more important in a sort of a also bigger picture. Yes, there's the, enrichment and reprocessing legitimate concern, but then also, we haven't really given clear passage or pathway to the repository being the real alternative. So I think, everyone is in this game so together, I think.
But I'd like to have a question concerning reprocessing in a different aspect. because in the international market, one of the key strategy of the Russia is that for the nations who cannot have the enrichment and reprocessing, they provide the fabrication technology and they get back to the Russia. So I think that would be another issue, because if it is successful, then Russia can collect all the spent fuel from all different nations. So I think that will raise another big issue in the international nuclear market. So what's your...
Plutonium in Russia. Yes, I've heard this before, and it's valid, except when you look at the separated plutonium, half of it's in the military cycle, half of it's in the civilian cycle. And, in the military cycle, most of it's in the U.S. and Russia. So, yes, I agree entirely with you, cradle to grave, and really grave. So you're taking back, you're not leaving any high-level waste, whether it's spent fuel or the residual from reprocessing. That should be a really big incentive to newcomer states to say, hey, we don't need these fuel cycle capabilities. They're going to take, they're going to give us the fuel and take it back. That's fantastic. It shouldn't just be Russia that does it. And I think what Jane was hinting at, and I fully support, the U.S. has to get its act together on a repository, and we should accept foreign fuel. We do it for research reactor fuel. So I know it's a big push. I mean, it's a big, lift politically for us to do it with power reactor fuel. But I think we should do it. I think eventually other nations should do it. If you start to become concerned about the proliferation implications, like, for example, if we really want to move towards a world free of nuclear weapons, and then what you're left with is this fuel cycle and, potential plutonium mine or, the buildup of that, then you've got to have an agreement on that. You have to have some verification or some restrictions. But I'm going to worry about that later. Let's get this, integrated fuel, whatever you want to call it, supply assurances. Let's get that off the ground. And for that to happen, we have to change some laws. The French won't keep the high-level waste, and it would be very useful for them to reconsider that.
Yes, please.
If I may add to Sharon's original point, of course, I agree that in the absence of strict NSG guidelines on supplying enrichment and reprocessing technologies, it's tough, right? Because, as you say, competitions increase after Fukushima, and so the norms go down as well, unfortunately. But I wonder whether, instead of focusing on the supply side, we can look at the demand side and kind of try to make the point that show that trying to import reprocessing or fast reactor technologies is not a good idea, by saying, look at all the economic costs and look at the past failures. Because for China, for example, calculations have been done that show that it's 90 times more expensive for China to do the reprocessing and move towards fast reactors than it is to bury the spent fuel. And then the UK is a good example as to where reprocessing has failed and where fast reactors have not materialized. The Japanese Monte reactor is also a good example where there's been accidents. And you Dr. Khalil, mentioned the BN600 reactor, but then I think one should reply that they had, I think, 3 separate cooling circles where they built so much redundancy into the system that where they had fire at one part of the cooling system, they could just extinguish the fire while keeping the reactor running at the other end. I'm not sure that would comply with current safety guidelines. So, these examples should be made to kind of decrease the demand for these kind of technologies.
Alan Hansen, MIT. First of all, one clarification. It is my understanding that the reactors sold to the United Arab Emirates retain American intellectual property and therefore are in every respect still subject to the U.S.-UAE nuclear cooperation agreement. And so there is no discontinuity in that regard. My question is going to be a little bit provocative. To my mind, being a responsible supplier means that you do not supply to irresponsible states. And so I'd like to ask the panel, I'm not asking anyone to name names, I understand that would not be politically correct, but I would like to have some definition of what an irresponsible state is and states to whom no one should export.
Excellent question, and I think it makes it a little more pointed. My general question about what it means to be a responsible supplier. And I believe we touched on it a little bit, but more maybe in relation to the safe operation and the domestic infrastructure to operate plants safely, and maybe didn't touch quite as much in terms of what these countries should have in place in terms of their policies and their non-proliferation and international security credentials, if you will. Any comments on this?
Sure. Just a brief comment. Without naming names, I mean, that kind of makes it a bit challenging. But I guess, looking at the potential buyers, I am aware of an instance where the supplier side would like the potential buyer to promise that there will be no future nuclear test, and that part is being a sort of sticking point in that particular bilateral discussions, and I find it unfortunate. I mean, it's sort of not the really direct answer, but I think there are certain things, and of course that particular case, the buyer side has a load of issues, and the sort of unprecedented case. But I think supplier side should be a lot more proactive in demanding these things as well, where the buyer side has had a checkered history, but then also, in a way, though, it's not a really good message for these potential buyers to, be, but I guess I pretty much named it, but the country, but, it is a very, important, the definition is important, but, I just find, just sort of my comment, not so much the answer to your question, but I find it very unfortunate that that particular point is becoming a sort of a sore point in as supplier side looks to the future market. I guess I'm not trying to be evasive, but I just but that's sort of my.
I think the question is really a tough one,
Yeah.
and I think it'll be very just unlikely that we will be successful in getting new user countries to make absolute guarantees of what parts of the technology they would implement in the future, and which parts they would just depend on the supplier to provide. So that's one challenge, is just foregoing rights to future applications of technology. Another one is frankly the possibility that there's an unstable situation, or a situation that was looked promising, or at least looked feasible in terms of exporting technology. Well, what's going to happen in the future? That technology, once it's there, it's there, and so the concern about it persists, and I think that's another very challenging part of that question.
To a quick response, I think one easy answer would be not to supply to countries that are outside the NPT. I don't think that should happen. I already named the country Pakistan. So I can name it again. I think that was an example of an unfortunate example of supply from China. That was against non-proliferation norms, but also against safety norms, because as far as I understand, the reactors that are being exported do not comply with any kind of current safety standard. So, yeah.
Just to add, the
Yes,
quick,
please, go ahead.
it kind of reminded me of some of our earlier discussion, dialogues. But it is sort of an interesting question. There is this, seemingly sort of rising interest in, buy, own, and operate model, and where if a potential buyer. I mean, it really comes down to, I guess, how long they need that sort of assistance. I mean, if a country, new entrant, has no interest or has not demonstrated the ability, I mean, of course, then the question is how do you define it? But, sooner rather than later, they would have to be able to, have their domestic capacity to operate it. So, any countries that do not give you the confidence they are interested, or, they might say they should be able to do it down the road, but, I mean, are, the ones that we really should take a close look at.
Okay, we're almost out of time. We may have time for one more question, if there are any. If not, well, thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists. I think you did a great job.